to be talking about container gardening. This is part of the Fairfax County Master Gardeners series on the virtual plant clinics. So today we're going to talk about why do we grow plants in containers, and what the types of containers are. I know there were a couple of questions that came in on that. We're going to be talking a little bit about plant design and a lot about planting, watering, fertilizing, and then preparing for your next season. So why do we use containers at all? First of all, some of us have limited space, especially space in full sun. So putting a container on a deck or a patio may be the only way we can grow a vegetable or a perennial that we happen to like. So catching the sunlight becomes really important for whatever plant we're hoping to grow. Another reason I grow plants in containers is I can move them away from my munching wildlife. I've got foxes and deers and all kinds of chipmunks and things that want to gobble up whatever I'm putting out there. And so one of the things is to put them in containers. You can shield the container and you can plant things. Another reason I like containers is I like mint. And I did a mint in the garden. It was rambunctious. And it took me 10 years to get rid of all the mint in the garden. So now I'll put these invasives that are really great herbs into pots so I can constrain their voracious growth. So containers come in all sizes, and as you can see from this slide, we've got containers like herbs on a pallet. We've got big wide pots for tomatoes and other things, and then we've got these pretty ceramic materials. However, containers only need to hold soil big enough for whatever you're going to plant. And you need about a 6 to 8 inch minimum distance in terms of your planting depth for most plants. You need to have something that has good water drainage. So you don't have to really worry about being overly sensitive about having a container that you purchase. You can put, a container can be anything you have around the house. So children's old rain gear, galoshes. I love this little picture of the old jeans that have been planted. It gives a little bit of whimsy to wherever you happen to be. So it can be as classic as you want or as whimsical as you want. What you need to do is to match the plant and the container. So one of the areas that you have to match is the root zone. The roots are your important thing in containers. So we're going to talk a lot about that. For example, if you have a tomato, a shallow pot will not hold the potato, the tomato, the squash, the zucchini, anything that has a lot of roots. You really need something with some depth. Plant pots, containers can be any material. You have to pay attention though. If you're going to use a foodstuff, you don't want a container that may be toxic and absorb toxicants through the roots into your vegetable. So you'll want to make sure that you stay good and clean for your vegetable containers. You also want containers that aren't going to topple over. I mean, there's nothing worse than having too small a container and having it tip over in the middle of summer every time the wind blows. That was one of the lessons I learned early on. And the other things, because I've gone for heavier pots, the use of a dolly for a plant helps you move it around. And it also allows you to have a little bit of air circulation through your drainage holes, which becomes very important for your root health. So what I try to do is think of what my mature or expected seasonal growth is for that plant and match the plant to that seasonal or mature growth. If I have a house plant, I put it in a pot that's appropriate for its growth this season and maybe next season, and plan on moving it to a larger pot. If I'm looking at a tomato, I try to get a pot that's big enough for that seasonal growth and deep enough for the roots that season. Now, some plants are going to need to have trellis support, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And root crops like carrots can be easily put into containers, but you need to have the soil depth for the crop. So the pot size can vary but depending on your plant. But recognize that a smaller pot, if it's outside in our hot, blistery Northern Virginia climate, will get hotter than the larger pot. And the root zone will also get hotter as a result. The stability of pots becomes really important. So square pots with straight edges are much more stable than the cone-shaped pots that I like. So these inverted cones are a little tippy unless they've got a large volume in which they have a lot of soil mass. The other thing is, if you put a plant in too big a pot, it won't be enough for the root zone and to absorb all that water, and you could have water left and cause root rot. So let's talk a little bit about vegetables in containers. Virginia Tech has offered us some varieties of how many plants can fit in different size of pots. Other universities have also suggested various pots. From the University of Illinois Extension, they've got another chart that has the size of pots per the variety of vegetables. So those are two references that I encourage you to look at if you're putting pots together. Again, the important thing is you have roots and you need a pot size to hold the roots. You have to have good air circulation to keep the diseases that you normally have from soil into the growing plant down. And if you're planning on staking a plant like a zucchini, a squash, a tomato, a bean, or something that is a voracious grower, consider using a bushy type and consider putting the stake in when you plant it. It may look a little odd for a while, but those stakes need to be firmly anchored into the pot. General rule of thumb is a container as tall as it is wide. Tall as it is wide. So drainage. Soggy soil makes wet roots. Wet roots lead to root rot, unless it's an aquatic plant. So the idea, if you have a pot that you desire to use and it doesn't have a hole, make one, or choose a different pot. That also goes to saucers. Saucers that fit directly into the pot, if it contains water and you keep the water in that pot, you don't get air circulation. That water stays in the pot, and that whole column of water keeps that moisture in the soil. That could also lead to root rot. So the solution is quite easy. Elevate your pot in some manner. Use a plant dolly on casters, use feet for your pots, or use gravel or other kind of pebbles or rocks inside your saucer and put your plant pot in the saucer so that you've got that air movement. Now, soil. There was a question about soil, and we'll get to that as we come to the questions part. But the soil choice depends upon the plant. Generally, I tend to use commercial potting soil because I know that it's mixed for my general use. But gardeners can also mix their own soil using a combination of peat moss, compost, and sand, perlite, vermiculite, or some other inorganic. The general rule of thumb, if you look over to the pie chart on the right, is that ideal soil is 25% air, 25% water, and 45% mineral soils and 5% organic soils. So that ideal soil is readily available in commercial soils, but gardeners can make their own. Important, this is not garden soil. This is planting soil, potting soil rather. So now let's get to the planting. First, we need to seek a clean container of the appropriate size. And you may use plant containers from last year. We need to clean those out, and we'll get to that later in the presentation. The soil, if you're using a container, new or old, use fresh commercial or fresh gardener mixed soil. The soil has, in the commercial soil, has a little bit of fertilizer in it, enough to last 2 weeks, but it also has that right blend. When you use soil that's already been used a year or two, it becomes leached out with some of their materials. So it's always a good investment to put new soil when you plant new plants. When I plant, I moisten the soil as I go along. I have fairly large planters, so I put some potting soil in, put a little water, not enough to saturate it, but enough to moisten it. Put some more soil, moisten that, put enough soil, moisten that. Then I make a space for my plant. I take my well-watered plant and I pull it out of the pot that it happens to be in. Now, you don't lift the plant by its head or its leaves. You turn the pot over and tap the bottom. Some cases, that plant will be so tight in there that you need to cut the plastic around the plant so that you can pull the plant out gently. A lot of plants have the circular roots around the bottom, and you see that in the upper picture, on the right. I gently tease out those circular roots so that they are no longer going in a circle. They are starting to move out so that they will grow into the soil. I also, on the side, take and tease some of those roots out so that they will also come laterally into the soil. So we're ready to put that unpotted plant into the hole. What you want to do is you want to make sure that your soil level in the pot, which is now about 1 inch or 2 below your pot lip, and your soil in the top of the plant are at the same level. You don't want to plant it too low, and you don't want to plant it too high. You really want to keep it right at that soil level. Then comes the watering. I water right at the stem. So where the stem comes out from, I take my hose and I put my hose right down close and drip, not spray, but drip water. Because I've already got a moist bed, I know that the water that's coming in will go into the roots of the potted plant and into the container. So you don't want to wet the foliage. A lot of people will just spray the whole foliage hoping that the water will all get down into the roots. You want to hit the roots with a slight trickle. And if you water the leaves, the chances of you having a leaf-borne disease are higher. I covered this. So watering, water at the soil line. Don't splash the leaves. Don't water from overhead. Don't do a big gush of water. Slow and steady will drip all the way through the soil. Some people who have a lot of plants on their deck, patio, or around their house will try to put some kind of a drip irrigation. And that could be as easy as a bag for a tree. It could be a container that has one of those, they sell them commercially, has those little porous nozzles. You fill up the water and it goes down. Those are great if you're on vacation and you want to make sure your plants live. But it also, you can use a container with holes poked around in the cap and around the top, fill it up, put it into the soil, and then you have a way of watering the plant on a continuous basis. Once a week or so, you want to make sure that your water, if you're fertilizing, you want to make sure that you're putting just straight water through the plant, because you don't want the soil to build up with the salts from the fertilizer or from the water. So how often do you water? Well, in our hot, humid days of full sun and summertime, it could be once a day, twice a day, 3 times a day, depends upon your pot size. Let's talk about fertilizer. A general rule of thumb is that use nitrogen for leafy growth, use phosphorus for root and fruit production, and you use potassium for cold hardiness, disease resistant, and the general durability of your plant. So when we think about the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, we think about what plant we're going to grow. So tomatoes do not like a lot of nitrogen. If you put a lot of nitrogen with a tomato, you'll get a lot of leaves and no fruit. The fruit will be delayed by a month, 3 weeks a month. Root crops require less nitrogen fertilizer than leafy crops. So if you're growing lettuce, kale, cabbage, that more nitrogen-rich fertilizer is great. If you're growing root crops, you want something that has more phosphorus. So there are types of fertilizers. The timed release are usually pellets. You put those in the container soil when you're planting the plant. And then you use a liquid diluted to whatever the manufacturer recommends for the type of plant that you have. You have foliar fertilizers, like I use on my air plants, which go onto the leaves and they green up. So the factors that we need to consider are: what nutrients do we need? Is it nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium? How often we need to put fertilizer, and what plant or what crop are we using? For herbs, we found that herbs need sparing amount of fertilizers. However, for vegetables and many houseplants and orchids, you want a weekly application of some diluted form of the liquid fertilizer. Again, the general rule of thumb: nitrogen for leaf growth, potassium, phosphorus for root production and fruit production, and potassium for disease resistance and general durability. So now let's talk about plant design. We've always heard the filler, thriller, spiller. It's a general horticultural design trick, but you don't have to use that. In this picture on the right-hand side, you see the thriller is the conifer. You see all of the fillers that have here, and then the spillers are your things that spill over the container lip. This generally gives a great look to whatever container you happen to be growing. But when you pick your plant choices, it's really a great idea to pick plant choices that like similar light, similar amounts of water, and similar amounts of fertilizer. It's very hard to separate out all of your watering and fertilizer requirements, and it's impossible to take your container and try to meet a sun-loving plant and a shade-loving plant in the same container. So when you think about what your combinations are, think about the similar properties, the similar characteristics, growing characteristics for your plants. Many of us like to grow companion vegetables together in containers. There is a great list, and there's many lists, but there's a great list put out by the West Virginia Extension Service on crops that have companion perennials and companion vegetables. And I put the reference for that here on this slide. Okay, so now we've had a growing season. We are turning to maintaining our containers. We take our containers, we empty the soil. The soil is perfectly good. It can be used in other parts of the garden, can be put into your compost pile, can be put into your in-ground vegetable, can be put around your perennials. But what you want to do is you want to clean the pot very well. Depending upon what kind of pot you have, you want to use some kind of a sanitizer, a liquid detergent, perhaps a light bleach solution if you've had a lot of soil problems, so if you've had a lot of diseases. What you don't want is to have the diseases migrate from one year to another growing season. You want to clean your pots really well, and then you want to store them generally upside down. So here are some container resources that I found very helpful, some from Virginia Tech, some from the University of Illinois Extension, and then one about trees and landscapes, containers and planters, because some of us like to try different things in containers, and there's a really good publication about that. So we got a couple of questions that came in ahead of time. And those questions related to what kind of soil works best. We covered earlier in the soil that is loose, drains well, and meets the sun requirements. So that for plants, I use a commercial mix, but you don't have to. You can mix by the gardener in the 1/3 peat, 1/3 mineral, and 1/3 organic. For containers, I use a new soil for every set of plants. Every time I change the plant and put a new plant in the container, I take that soil out and I put it into other parts of the garden. Now, we want to also recognize that the reason we do this is sometimes some of our diseases for our plants are soil-borne diseases. And so we want to, whether in the garden or in the containers, we want to make sure that we rotate our crops every 3 years, once every 3 years. This is especially important for tomatoes and families like peas and beans and squashes and pumpkins. Somebody asked, how do we grow containers and how do we grow zucchinis and squashes in containers? It's challenging. These are sprawling plants that love to send out their vines everywhere into the garden. So one of the things is to choose a bush type of those plants rather than a viney plant. Then it's to put into the pot vertically growing stakes, which could be a stake. It could be stakes in a tripod put together with string or around it so that it's interspersed so your plant can grow up through there. It can be using a tomato cage. They come in round and they come in square. Or it could just be using a tripod. This picture that you see on the right is my tripod I've used for years. It was pricey to start with those two metal pieces, but I've used them now 5 or 6 years. What we've got growing there right now is beans, but I've also grown cucumbers and squash on that type of a trellis. It's not in a container, but this is the kind of shape that you would want in your container. So you want to, some of the extension services say that you want, for squash and zucchini specifically, you want a container that is a 24-inch wide, which would also mean that you want a fairly deep container because you want to be able to handle all the roots plus support whatever trellis that you're using. You want to water this plant well. You want to have exceptional drainage because these plants do not like to have wet feet. You want to fertilize appropriate, and squash and zucchini love, love, love full sun. They don't like partial shade. So what kind of perennials grow best in containers? I can't really think of one that doesn't. Some of our gardeners out there may have some things that they think don't grow well in containers, but if you choose the right kind of species, that is not tall viney, but rather bushy forms, I think you can grow just about anything in tomatoes. I mean, everything in containers. You can grow outdoor plants, you can grow vegetables, you can grow blueberries, you can grow trees. What's critical is that you meet the plant's needs. You have enough soil, you give it enough water, you give it enough fertilizer, enough space, and you have sunlight. So where do we get seedlings? This question came from somebody who only knows about Merrifield Garden Center. There's lots of garden centers out there. And so garden centers, nurseries, you might have a neighbor with some seedlings to spare. And the big box stores also have seedlings. You can also check out some online services, and you can start it from seed, just not at this time of year. So what kind of perennials work best in containers? Well, as I said, almost anything works in containers. Virginia Tech has a great publication that says trees for landscape containers and planters. So you can grow all kinds of trees in a container. Again, the container needs to be appropriately sized, breadth and depth, and with the right kind of soil. But you can grow all kinds of them. So I put that link here for people who are interested in growing any kind of trees in containers. So what kind of trellises or cages work for the type of fruit? You need a sturdy, well-anchored support of whatever design works for you. In this case, you've got some peppers and some tomatoes growing up a typical flat trellis, but that trellis could be teepee-shaped, it could be ring-shaped. It just needs to have the support to keep that vine up, and it needs to be very good and well anchored. So basically anything that you would use in the ground, if you've got the right sized pot, you can put in a container. One of the important things with some of these heavier crops is that you want to make sure that your plant isn't top heavy in your container. So you want a pretty good sized pot with enough space that's heavy enough so that when the wind blows over or you get some of our gaily winds in the middle of summer, you don't find your plant tipped over. So what shape of containers? It's almost anything we talked about earlier. You could have a barrel. In this barrel, you see a diagram on the left where it has a perforated pipe all the way through it to allow moisture to get all the way down. And that's a pretty good size container. So you could put a number of plants around that and be sure that you're well watering the whole length of that barrel. For some plants that have a variety of planting needs, you could use a pyramidal shape. So you see this nested set of boxes where you have a large box, another box, and another box on top. This box on top would have soil that would go this 4 to 6 inches, this 4 to 6 inches, and this 4 to 6 inches. So you could grow a plant that really requires a lot of roots all the way down, where in this layer, you would grow something that doesn't require more than 4 to 6 inches of roots. And then if you want a little bit of whimsy, you can use any kinds of containers that you might have around the house. So we had a question about what crops are coming up now in Virginia. This question is really dependent upon where we live in Virginia and what our microclimates are. So I pulled up one of Virginia Tech's planting guide, in which we can see the hardiness zone of where we are located. Generally, most of us are located in zone 7A, but there's a few of us in zone 6B and some of us in zone 7B. And in that, we have our frost date and first frost date and our last frost date. But in this particular Virginia Tech publication, we also have some planting guide, and it's by zone. So I pulled up the zone 7A just to give you an example, where you could have a calendar. And so here we are around the 5th of July. The asterisk is plant and harvest period. The X's indicate a planting period, and the zeros indicate a harvest period. So you can identify what possible vegetables you might want to, or crops you might want to plant now or in the future, or for next year, start planning when you want to put your materials in containers and in pots. And that was all the questions I got. I will entertain questions from the floor.
Okay, so we had Melinda asked about specifics for fertilizer, nitrogen, and soil for vegetable and fruit plants, which I thought you answered pretty well. So Melinda.
Yeah, I think I'm good. Thank you so much.
And then she also asked about what grows well in the summer and fall. So you just answered that.
Yeah, all that, thanks.
And then somebody asked about figs and pots, which Mary directed them to, Mary answered their question and then I directed them to their YouTube page. But Anne, do you know anything about growing figs in pots?
No, I've tried to grow a fig in the ground. My brother-in-law grew a huge brown fig, was delicious, in the soil. I don't know anything about figs in containers. Does anybody else?
Someone did a presentation. It's up on our YouTube page. And just check it out. But the person had really great success with them.
Great.
There are actually a couple people that had great success with growing figs and pots. So I'd say check that out if you want more information.
I will interject. This is Carlotta. You need a lot of sunlight wherever you have your fig. I have a fig tree in my front yard, but I have wonderful southwest exposure. So it stays pretty well lit most of the time.
Hi, this is Kathleen. I asked the question and I did actually get to enjoy the fig presentation earlier. My question was more related to the pot size. I'm guessing that we'd have to invest $1 billion in a pot big enough to grow a fig. Just perhaps not that much, but
you want a pot that has a really, because a fig gets tall and bushy, you want something that's going to be wide. So you may be actually looking at an architectural planting unit. So more like something that would be a raised bed rather than a movable container. And if you're going to put a fig that's going to grow a great size, you definitely want to either decide it's stationary or you're going to put it in something that has a really good moving system so that you can move it around. That is and it's going to have some pretty good space for the roots.
that does help. I have several sticks in the ground that used to be figs and just never made it through the winter. So I thought maybe putting it in a pot that I could move it might actually get me 2 years out of one plant.
Yeah, yeah, and you might be able to, but you want a deep pot and you want a wide pot. And so you want to look at some horticultural pots, probably not necessarily the ones that you would buy at the garden center, but something you'd buy from a horticultural supply house, because you want it. For example, Virginia State University had a terrific video on growing blueberries in containers. And their recommendation was a minimum of 7 gallons. So that's a pretty big size pot.
Yes, it
So
is.
I would expect a fig to be somewhere in that same size or maybe a little bigger. And I think you might have to order that online.
Okay, you answered my question. Thank you so much. Your presentation was just absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Anybody got anything else for Ann? Otherwise, we'll move into, we got some questions sent in.
Tori, I just wanted to add something real quick about the figs. Something I was surprised about from the presentation was that certain fig trees need pollinate themselves to grow the fruit, and some don't. And that was new information. So you might, Ked, you might want to just double check too what kind of fig tree you have.
I had one more question. So I had read about, or I'd heard that tomatoes have a really extensive root system, and so they should be planted really as deep as possible. Are cucumbers like that as well?
The cucumbers I've grown have a pretty extensive root system, not anywhere near like a tomato.
Okay.
But they're pretty extensive. Now, when you plant a tomato, you know the trick about planting tomatoes is tomatoes will grow anywhere on their hairy root stem. So many of us as gardeners will take the lower stems off and deeply plant the stems. So when you get it in a pot, you will see that the pot is maybe this big. And if the plant is this big, I will generally strip off the bottom third of all of its leaves, and I will plant the soil all the way down, because that allows a lot of roots to grow for a tomato.